Good afternoon. As introduced by Steve, my name's Charmaine Dine. I work for Avon Somerset Police. I work within the early intervention team, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but really I'm here to tell you about the work that we've been doing with the Violence Reduction Partnership around youth violence in Taunton and Bridgwater. So the early intervention team, for those of you that don't know, we look to identify children at risk of serious youth violence and/or exploitation, and we do that using a mixture of police and partner data. We take referrals in from various partners as well as reviewing the data that we hold. We then look to share that information and work with partners to try and address concerns around those children, looking for gaps in provision and trying to fill those gaps. We also do a bit of a global offer where we try and signpost and share information that's useful to partners and people working with children and also with parents. And we also look at groups and locations to see what work we can do around those. So we started out in Avon Somerset about 3 years ago doing something called hotspot policing. So they've identified all the violence hotspot locations across Avon and Somerset. These hotspots are the areas that you consistently experience higher levels of violent crime. We put something called pulse patrols into those areas, which is an internationally recognised scheme where we go and put officers in the area at the key times of offending for them to do time patrols. They use their body-worn cameras and engage with people that they find there and obviously deal with any incidents that might happen whilst they're there. Although this can be really effective in reducing crime in long-term crime hotspots, what we find is they don't have the same impact everywhere and they don't always work for all areas. What we do know is that the people involved in violence in those areas may change, but the affected locations remain the same. So what we then look to do is to focus on long-term problem-solving approach in those areas. We went back to our crime analysts and asked them to review all the data, but to then specifically look at offences involving under 18s, either as a victim or an offender of non-domestic violence across Somerset. And they identified 2 key locations for us, one of which was East Street in Taunton, and then there were 3 adjoining areas in Bridgwater Town Centre. We then looked at putting targeted problem-solving plans into place for those areas. This has been going on since summer 2003. The focus was on reducing the impact of violence on children in these identified hotspots. The primary objective was to reduce the frequency of violence involving under 18s in those areas. And then the secondary objective was to reduce the harm associated with under 18s in those hotspot areas. So we took a partnership approach, because we are very much about trying to work with our partners, and we use something called the SARA problem-solving model. SARA simply stands for scanning, analysis, response, and then assessment, and it's just a circular program of working through those stages to understand a problem. We also used an evidence-based policing approach, so we looked to things like the Youth Endowment Fund that assess different initiatives to understand their effectiveness. We also referred to information from the College of Policing and looked at various different initiatives that had happened around the country, including in Shepherd's Bush with some work around McDonald's. As I say, it was very much a Somerset VRP approach. The policing teams involved was obviously the early intervention team, but also working with neighbour policing teams and the ASB teams, and also being backed up by response colleagues. From the council, we had the local community networks, town wardens, youth justice, family intervention service, children's social care and the exploitation team. We also partnered with Young Somerset as we went along, local business communities, including McDonald's very specially, Taunton Town Council, Chambers of Commerce, schools and colleges, most importantly children and young people, and then using some funding we'd secured from the VRP and the Safer Streets project, we were then able to look at responses we could put into place about these issues. So to give you an understanding of the scope of the issue, Taunton and East Street in particular, for those of you that know Taunton, it's that area along by McDonald's and Primark and Kentucky Fried Chicken and all those big busy places that attract young people. That came up as the 7th highest area for violence involving children in Avon and Somerset Police area. What we found when we did a deep dive into those crimes is that the people involved were predominantly female, which was quite surprising, and they were 14 to 16-year-olds. We found that the incidents were predominantly happening on Saturdays between 1 in the afternoon and 11 o'clock at night. We did find that there were limited repeat offenders at the location, although they were commonly known to us for drugs and ASB. We did find that those involved as offenders at McDonald's were quite often linked to missing person reports. The majority of the incidents involved groups of victims and offenders where they were already known to each other, with existing tensions that might have started off in schools or in parks or online. As I say, there was a certain amount of ASB around the McDonald's in Taunton in particular, but we found that the incidents were very sporadic, they were unplanned, and they weren't involving weapons. Bridgewater told us a different picture, and I know you won't be able to see that map terribly well on there, but we were able to identify that High Street, Cornhill, St Mary Street and 4th Street in Bridgewater all fell within the top 11 locations for violence involving children across Avon and Somerset. We found that there the incidents happened throughout the week between 4 and 6, so that kind of travelling home from school time, and then again between 7 and midnight. They were predominantly males involved in Bridgewater, around 14 to 17 years old. 74% of the offenders were linked to the same network. The majority involved groups, and again victims and offenders that knew each other. And the altercations, we also saw altercations with intoxicated adults in those areas, ASB, large-scale disorders, and again we found that quite often there were existing tensions. Eastover and Bridgewater told a slightly different story. The incidents there happened between 10 and 1 in the morning on a Saturday, but it was also again through that 4 till 6 in the evenings after school. There again we saw that it was predominantly male, but they were that little bit younger, predominantly 13 to 14 years old, and 74% of those offenders were kind of linked to each other already. The majority of the incidents involved groups again. 39% were previously known to each other, and there were again those existing tensions, ASB in the area with unprovoked attacks. We did find it a little bit different, that 24% involved alcohol in that area, which was different to the other areas, but again they were sporadic and unplanned incidents. All this data was great and gave us a really good idea of who was involved, when they were there, when it was happening, but it didn't give us a great deal of detail with regards to the young person's perspective. So we went out to try and understand that by carrying out a youth survey across Taunton and Bridgewater. We were really lucky and managed to get 1,200 surveys completed by the children and young people, and they were quite long surveys, were about 40 to 50 questions each. So it would have taken quite a bit of time. We were really encouraged that young people wanted to speak to us about it and tell us their perspectives. What we did find of those people was that only 10% had been a victim or an offender, and only 18% of those had reported the incident to the police. So we know that there's a large amount of underreporting. They told us also that they were equally concerned, both in Taunton and Bridgewater, by the threat that was posed to them by adults as much as any threat posed by other children. They told us they wanted more information about what to do if they saw or were involved in a violent incident. And they told us they wanted that information in schools, but they wanted to be getting it from parents, teachers, and the police. We did do some work about asking them what they felt would help improve the situation, and my inexperience in survey writing didn't help, but they came back very much with CCTV, street lighting, community guardians, and supervised spaces. So, having done all that research and done the analysis to try and understand what it was telling us, we were then looking at our response to this. So working with partners, we looked at what we could all bring to the table, literally all sat round in a room together. It was agreed that obviously the hotspot patrols would carry on in those areas and the neighbourhood policing team would carry on doing their usual work there. But then we looked at the education side of it, because obviously this was a key thing for the young people. We commissioned an organisation called Collaborate Digital, who then went in and designed packages in schools across the areas with young people and children, and helped us design packages for key stages 3, 4 and 5. They produced videos talking about their experiences, and again it very much came through that although we recognise there's an issue between children assaulting other children, their concerns very much focused on some of the adults that they see in that area. These packages will now get rolled out across the rest of Somerset and are available for PHSE lessons. In addition to that, we also commissioned an organisation called Beyond Equality, who deliver training about positive masculinity. Again, this was rolled out across 3 schools as a pilot, and from that we've developed a toolkit that can go out across all the schools across Somerset. In regards to the underreporting, we've done a lot of work around promoting Fearless, and Fearless have worked very closely with us on that. That's also been promoted through newsletters, leaflets and websites, but as I'm sure many of you'll know, trying to get your message out there can be really challenging at times. We also produced something, antisocial behaviour leaflet for use in the town centres. For those that you aren't aware, if a child comes to attention for antisocial behaviour across Somerset or across Avon and Somerset, at the point that they come to attention, we will write home to their parents. We'll write home to their parents on a couple of occasions, and if they come to attention on the 3rd time, we will actually go and visit the address and speak with the parents and the children there. But to try and help support the understanding of the parents and the children, we devised a new leaflet which speaks all about the link between antisocial behaviour, particularly in town centres, and the links to violence. As I say, although this has gone out through our ASB teams, it's also gone out through some of our partners as well. We looked at the social environment, so obviously we're aware that there's a lot of guardians in that area, or potential guardians, in the form of shopkeepers and people passing through the area. So we offered bystander training for local businesses, so that if they were aware of an incident or something was happening within their premises, then they felt better equipped to be able to challenge that without feeling that they were putting themselves at risk. We've also looked at the built environment, seeing if there's any work that we could do to make the area safer that way. This is work's ongoing, so we'll wait to see what happens with that. We also looked at diversion and enforcement for the street community, so that's been delivered through the local council and through policing. And from a community guardians perspective, we also looked at having street wardens in the area, so have provided additional funding for street wardens to be in the areas of most concern at the key times for us. So again, those early evenings and weekends. We also produced a web page. The link's there. It's not terribly good, but if you go to the, or to read off the slide, but if you go to the Somerset Gov site and go type in town centre safety and young people, that will come up. Again, that provides many of the signposting that's in the leaflet, with links to organisations to support young people, support them around resilience and around mental health and around dealing with conflict. The last thing we looked at was really about that focusing on safe spaces for children in the right areas at the right times. And so we looked at devising youth hubs. So we went out to tender to try and find a youth organisation across Somerset that could deliver these hubs for us. And we were really pleased that Young Somerset were able to come back and do this for us. And we've worked with them quite closely since, and coming up to the 18-month mark. And we are funded to run for another year from here. So they deliver some youth hubs for us. So one is in McDonald's, because that's where the young people are that need that help and support, and that's where we're seeing the incidents. They're there on a Saturday between 3 and 5, and in Bridgewaters between 3 and 5, Primarily, they were operating out of Coffee Number 1 in the 4th Street, Bridgewater, which is pretty much in the middle of the area, but they're hopefully soon going to move to their own premises in Angel Place, which hopefully will be a little bit more welcoming for children. What we have found with the hubs is it has helped improve community cohesion and crime reduction, and it's very much about engaging with children in the spaces they choose to be in at the times that they choose to be there, and talking to them about their concerns and signposting them to positive activities that they might want to get involved in. It provides very much a safe space between children and the wider community in those areas. There was quite often conflict in those areas between adults and children, and between businesses and children. So it's provided a much safer space for them to stay and take part. What we found there is actually McDonald's customers have fed back what difference it's made. They're really pleased to see the, young people there. They're really pleased to see them engaging with young Somerset. Over that time, they've engaged with over 1,800 children and young people. And although it's primarily aimed at children, very happy to speak to young people, parents, anybody in the community that would have any concerns. And as I say, it's very much around doing that advice and signposting. We do a lot of work around understanding the voice of the child, gathering their thoughts and concerns about what we can do to best support them. Neighbourhood policing team were able to drop in. This provides a really nice informal opportunity for the police to engage with young people in there. And McDonald's very kindly have helped support and probably encourage some engagement from young people by saying, actually, if you engage with young Somerset, then we will give you a voucher for a free drink, which you can imagine is really popular. So having put all these bits of work in place, we're really keen to make sure that we understood what benefits it may or may not have had and whether it was effective. So we reviewed the same data that had been reviewed for the 5 years previously to identify the hotspots, and then reviewed it over the August when we started the work through till March 2024. By March 2024, we'd only been running the hubs for about 2 months. What we did find, though, is that violent crime involving under 18s for that period had fallen to below the 5-year average and was actually the lowest it had been since COVID. The hotspots with a decrease in particular were also those that were having regular patrols under op habit, which is that hotspot policing. We also found that McDonald's had dropped in the number of incidents it was related to or incidents occurring at their location. But we did find that despite an overall reduction in violence offences across both areas, in Bridgewater, there was an increase in harm in the High Street, St Mary Street area, which had seen an increase in harm and driven up the harm overall for all areas. In July, we reviewed that data again, and it showed us that there'd been a 12% reduction in the number of offences across the areas for the previous 2 years. The harm was reduced by around a third when compared with the 2 previous years as well. Taunton in particular, we saw the greatest reduction in youth violence, both in terms of crime count and that crime harm, and problems around McDonald's remained much lower than they had previously. Bridgewater, we did see small increases across all the areas of 1 to 3 crimes, and the number of children involved in violence across that still reduced by 25%. Fewer children were involved in violence in Taunton, but across Bridgewater and other B areas, we found it remained much the same. It was really about understanding how efficient or effective it was. So it was really important to compare the crime stats for those areas with other areas. We reviewed again the data in November 24, and again found that the violent crime affecting under 18s decreased by 59% in the Taunton area, but in Bridgewater, sadly, there'd been a 44% increase. I don't know how well you can see those bar charts, but they show quite a clear pattern. Across the 3 hotspots areas, in a control area elsewhere, where there was no intervention, we did find that violent crime affecting under 18s had increased by 30%, and across the force it had increased by 12%. Whereas in Taunton, all violent crime had gone up by 13%, as opposed to that reduction that we saw in that particular area. The crime harm in the Taunton hotspot decreased by 56%, whereas the harm in Bridgewater had increased by 65%. And the harm associated with violence involving under 18 had also decreased by 15%. So you can see that kind of balance there. Days without violent crime, we found in Taunton it decreased from 5% days experiencing violent crime to just 2%. Bridgewater saw an increase from 7% to 9%. And the control area, again, had a 3% increase in the days with numbers of violent crime. Numbers of children, as you can imagine, had reduced in Taunton, but we did find in Bridgewater that there was an increase of numbers of children involved. 17% of those involved were linked to violence offences before the problem solving had begun, and again after it was in place. Crime displacement is obviously a concern when you're carrying out any problem solving area in a very specific area. In Bridgewater, in Taunton, we found there was a 69% reduction in violent crime affecting under 18s in a 100-metre radius around that area, which, as you can imagine, covers quite a large area of Taunton town centre. Unfortunately, in Bridgewater, we saw a 200% increase in the surrounding areas. So the conclusions that we've drawn is that we've met the objectives of reducing the harm in Taunton, that fewer children were becoming involved in violence in the area, and there was no evidence to suggest that any of that had been displaced. Increases in both volume and harm in Bridgewater, but it is possible that a small group of persistent offenders in that area have been driving it up. There is now work ongoing very closely looking at those young people. There has been positive feedback from partners and the community and from young people themselves, and the work was highlighted by the HMIC FRS, which is His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary's Fire and Rescue Service. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful. So the learning that we took from it as we went through was that it's very important. As you can see, in Taunton we had a clearly defined location and we had a real focus for our problem solving plan, whereas in Bridgewater we didn't have the same, and we do feel that's impacted on the results that we've seen. It's really important to have that early engagement with our partners so that you understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, and we can all understand what we can all bring to the table. And one of the other things we found was that communication, trying to get out to partners and to the community, is really more challenging than you think. Moving forward, those hotspot patrols will continue. The resources that we've developed in the forms of packages for schools, leaflets, and the website will all remain in place. And that learning has been shared and has been adopted elsewhere within the force. The Highlight Youth Hubs, as I've said, were actually going to continue, and we've got funding for another year, and actually been able to get some additional funding so we can expand that service, and are hoping to run 2 in East Somerset area as well. And we very much invite any partners or agencies that would like to come and engage with children to come and be there at those hubs with us. And lastly, I'd just really like to thank everybody that supported us with this initiative.